12. She stood in front of her easel with a half-finished canvas on it, the old man in the armchair behind her observing every stroke of her brush. "It's time we went home," he said, at last with a glance at his watch. She laid down her palette and went into the bathroom to wash. The old man raised himself out of the armchair and reached for his cane, which was leaning against a table. The door of the studio led directly out to the lawn. It was growing dark. 50 feet away was a white clapboard house. The ground floor windows were lit. Sabina was moved by the two windows shining out into the dying day. All her life she had proclaimed Kitsch her enemy, but hadn't she in fact been carrying it with her? Her Kitsch was her image of home, all peace, quiet and harmony, and ruled by a loving mother and a wise father. It was an image that took shape within her after the death of her parents. The less her life resembled that sweetest of dreams, the more sensitive she was to its magic, and more than once she had shed tears when the ungrateful daughter in a sentimental film embraced the neglected father. As the windows of the happy family's house shone out into the dying day. She had met the old man in New York. He was rich and liked paintings. He lived alone with his wife, also aging, in a house in the country. Facing the house, but still on his land, stood an old stable. He had had it remodeled into a studio for Sabina and would follow the movements of her brush for days on end. Now all three of them were having supper together. The old woman called Sabina "my daughter," but all indications would lead one to believe the opposite, namely that Sabina was the mother and that her two children doted on her, worshipped her, would do anything she asked. Had she then herself on the threshold of age found the parents who had been snatched from her as a girl? Had she at last found the children she had never had herself? She was well aware it was an illusion. Her days with the aging couple were merely a brief interval. The old man was seriously ill, and when his wife was left on her own, she would go and live with their son in Canada. Sabina's path of betrayals would then continue elsewhere, and from the depths of her being, a silly, mawkish song about two shining windows and the happy family living behind them would occasionally make its way into the unbearable lightness of being. Though touched by the song, Sabina did not take her feeling seriously. She knew only too well that the song was a beautiful lie. As soon as kitsch is recognized for the lie it is, it moves into the context of non-kitsch, thus losing its authoritarian power and becoming as touching as any other human weakness. For none among us is Superman, enough to escape kitsch completely. No matter how we scorn it, kitsch is an integral part of the human condition. 13. Kitsch has its source in the categorical agreement with being. But what is the basis of being? God? Mankind? Struggle? Love? Man? Woman? Since opinions vary, there are various kitsches. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Communist, Fascist, Democratic, Feminist, European, American, National, International. Since the days of the French Revolution, one half of Europe has been referred to as the left, the other half as the right. Yet to define one or the other by means of the theoretical principles it professes is all but impossible, and no wonder. Political movements rest not so much on rational attitudes as on the fantasies, images, words, and archetypes that come together to make up this or that political kitsch. The fantasy of the Grand Marche that France was so intoxicated by is the political kitsch joining leftists of all times and tendencies. The Grand March is the splendid march on the road to brotherhood, equality, justice, happiness. It goes on, obstacles notwithstanding, for obstacles there must be if the march is to be the Grand March. The dictatorship of the proletariat or democracy, rejection of the consumer society or demands for increased productivity, the guillotine or an end to the death penalty. It is all beside the point. What makes a leftist is not this or that theory, but his ability to integrate any theory into the kitsch called the Grand March. 14. France was obviously not a devotee of kitsch. The fantasy of the Grand March played more or less the same role in his life as the mawkish song about the two brightly lit windows in Sabina's. What political party did France vote for? I am afraid he did not vote at all. He preferred to spend election day hiking in the mountains, which does not, of course, imply that he was no longer touched by the Grand March. It is always nice to dream that we are part of a jubilant throng marching through the centuries, and France never quite forgot the dream. One day, some friends phoned him from Paris. They were planning a march on Cambodia and invited him to join them. Cambodia had recently been through American bombardment, a civil war, a paroxysm of carnage by local communists that reduced the small nation by a fifth, and finally occupation by neighboring Vietnam, which by then was a mere vassal of Russia. Cambodia was racked by famine and people were dying for want of medical care. An international medical committee had repeatedly requested permission to enter the country, but the Vietnamese had turned them down. The idea was for a group of important Western intellectuals to march the Cambodian border, and by means of this great spectacle performed before the eyes of the world to force the occupied country to allow the doctors in. The friend who spoke to Franz was one he had marched with through the streets of Paris. At first, Franz was thrilled by the invitation, but then his eye fell on his student mistress sitting across the room in an armchair. She was looking up at him, her eyes magnified by the big round lenses in her glasses. Franz had the feeling those eyes were begging him not to go, and so he apologetically declined. No sooner had he hung up than he regretted his decision. True, he had taken care of his earthly mistress, but he had neglected his unearthly love. Wasn't Cambodia the same as Sabina's country? A country occupied by its neighbor's communist army? A country that had felt the brunt of Russia's fist? All at once, Franz felt that his half-forgotten friend had contacted him at Sabina's secret bidding. Heavenly bodies know all and see all. If he went on the march, Sabina would gaze down on him enraptured. She would understand that he had remained faithful to her. "Would you be terribly upset if I went on the march?" he asked the girl with the glasses, who counted every day away from him a loss, yet could not deny him a thing. Several days later, he was in a large jet taking off from Paris with 20 doctors and about 50 intellectuals, professors, writers, diplomats, singers, actors, and mayors, as well as 400 reporters and photographers. "15. The plane landed in Bangkok. 470 doctors, intellectuals, and reporters made their way to the large ballroom of an international hotel, where more doctors, actors, singers, and professors of linguists had gathered with several hundred journalists bearing notebooks, tape recorders, and cameras, still and video. On the podium, a group of 20 or so Americans sitting at a long table were presiding over the proceedings. The French intellectuals with whom Franz had entered the ballroom felt slighted and humiliated. The march on Cambodia had been their idea, and here the Americans, supremely unabashed as usual, had not only taken over, but had taken over in English without a thought that a Dane or a Frenchman might not understand them. And because the Danes had long since forgotten that they once formed a nation of their own, the French were the only Europeans capable of protest. So high were their principles that they refused to protest in English and made their case to the Americans on the podium in their mother tongue. The Americans, not understanding a word, reacted with friendly, agreeing smiles. In the end, the French had no choice but to frame their objection in English. Why is this meeting in English when there are Frenchmen present? Though amazed at so curious an objection, the Americans, still smiling, acquiesced. The meeting would be run bilingually. Before it could resume, however, a suitable interpreter had to be found. Then every sentence had to resound in both English and French, which made the discussion take twice as long, or rather more than twice as long, since all the French had some English and kept interrupting the interpreter to correct him, disputing every word. The meeting reached its peak when a famous American actress rose to speak. Because of her, even more photographers and cameramen streamed into the auditorium, and every syllable she pronounced was accompanied by the click of another camera. The actress spoke about suffering children, about the barbarity of communist dictatorship, the human right to security, the current threat to the traditional values of civilized society, the inalienable freedom of the human individual, and President Carter, who was deeply sorrowed by the events in Cambodia. By the time she had pronounced her closing words, she was in tears. Then up jumped a young French doctor with a red mustache and shouted, "We are here to cure dying people, not to pay homage to President Carter. Let's not turn this into an American propaganda circus. We are not here to protest against communism. We are here to save lives." He was immediately seconded by several other Frenchmen. The interpreter was frightened and did not dare translate what they said, so the 20 Americans on the podium looked on once more with smiles full of goodwill, many nodding agreement. One of them even lifted his fist in the air because he knew Europeans liked to raise their fists in times of collective euphoria. 16. How can it be that leftist intellectuals, because the doctor with the mustache was nothing if not a leftist intellectual, are willing to march against the interests of a communist country when communism has always been considered the left's domain? When the crimes of the country called the Soviet Union became too scandalous, a leftist had two choices: either to spit on his former life and stop marching, or, more or less sheepishly, to reclassify the Soviet Union as an obstacle to the Grand March and march on. Have I not said that what makes a leftist is the kitsch of the Grand March? The identity of kitsch comes not from a political strategy, but from images, metaphors, and vocabulary. It is therefore possible to break the habit and march against the interest of a communist country. What is impossible, however, is to substitute one word for others. It is possible to threaten the Vietnamese army with one's fist. It is impossible to shout, "Down with communism! Down with communism!" is a slogan belonging to the enemies of the Grand March. And anyone worried about losing face must remain faithful to the purity of his own kitsch. The only reason I bring all this up is to explain the misunderstanding between the French doctor and the American actress who, egocentric as she was, imagined herself the victim of envy or misogyny. In point of fact, the French doctor displayed a finely honed aesthetic sensibility. The phrases President Carter, our traditional values, the barbarity of communism all belong to the vocabulary of American kitsch and have nothing to do with the kitsch of the Grand March. 17. The next morning, they all boarded buses and rode through Thailand to the Cambodian border. In the evening, they pulled into a small village where they had rented several houses on stilts. The regularly flooding river forced the villagers to live above ground level, while their pigs huddled down below. Franz slept in a room with four other professors. From afar came the oinking of the swine. From up close, the snores of famous mathematician. In the morning, they climbed back into the buses. At a point about a mile from the border, all vehicular traffic was prohibited. The border crossing could be reached only by means of a narrow, heavily guarded road. The buses stopped, the French contingent poured out of them, only to find that again the Americans had beaten them and formed the vanguard of the parade. The crucial moment had come. The interpreter was recalled and a long quarrel ensued. At last everyone assented to the following. The parade would be headed by one American, one Frenchman, and the Cambodian interpreter. Next would come the doctors, and only then the rest of the crowd. The American actress brought up the rear. The road was narrow and lined with minefields. Every so often it was narrowed even more by a barrier, two cement blocks wound round with barbed wire, passable only in single file. About 15 feet ahead of Franz was a famous German poet and pop singer who had already written 930 songs for peace and against war. He was carrying a long pole topped by a white flag that set off his full black beard and set him apart from the others. All up and down the long parade, photographers and cameramen were snapping and whirring their equipment, dashing up to the front, pausing, inching back, dropping to their knees, then straightening up and running even farther ahead. Now and then they would call out the name of some celebrity who would then unwittingly turn in their direction just long enough to let them trigger their shutters. 18. Something was in the air. People were slowing down and looking back. The American actress, who had ended up in the rear, could no longer stand in the disgrace of it, and determined to take the offensive, was sprinting to the head of the parade. It was as if a runner in a 5-kilometer race who had been saving his strength by hanging back with the pack had suddenly sprung forward and started overtaking his opponents one by one. The men stepped back with embarrassed smiles, not wishing to spoil the famous runner's bid for victory, but the women yelled, "Get back in line! This is no star parade!" Undaunted, the actress pushed on, a suite of 5 photographers and 2 cameramen in tow. Suddenly, a French woman, a professor of linguistics, grabbed the actress by the wrist and said in terrible-sounding English, "This is a parade for doctors who have come to care for mortally ill Cambodians, not a publicity stunt for movie stars." The actress's wrist was locked in the linguistic professor's grip. She could do nothing to pry it loose. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she said in perfect English. "I've been in hundreds of parades like this. You won't get anywhere without stars. It's our job. Our moral obligation." "Merde!" said the linguistics professor in perfect French. The American actress understood and burst into tears. "Hold it, please," A cameraman called out and knelt at her feet. The actress gave a long look into his lens, the tears flowing down her cheeks. 19. When at last the linguistics professor let go of the American actress's wrist, the German pop singer with the black beard and white flag called out her name. The American actress had never heard of him, but after being humiliated, she was more receptive to sympathy than usual and ran over to him. The singer switched the pole to his left hand and put his right arm around her shoulders. They were immediately surrounded by new photographers and cameramen. A well-known American photographer, having trouble squeezing both their faces and the flag into his viewfinder because the pole was so long, moved back a few steps into the rice field. And so it happened that he stepped on a mine. An explosion rang out, and his body, ripped to pieces, went flying through the air, raining a shower of blood on the European intellectuals. The singer and the actress were horrified and could not budge. They lifted their eyes to the flag. It was spattered with blood. Once more they were horrified. Then they timidly ventured a few more looks upward and began to smile slightly. They were filled with a strange pride, a pride they had never known before. The flag they were carrying had been consecrated by blood. Once more they joined the march.